Hello, and welcome to the No Bad Questions podcast, where I try to learn in a conversational manner by sitting down with people who have interesting careers, important lessons to tell, or inspiring stories. I hope that you learn something too. If you want to support the podcast, please follow or subscribe on your platform of choice. You can also like or comment to boost the algorithms or share out to your network to make sure it gets more views. But ultimately, and what I hope you choose to do, is listen to the very end. With that, we'll start today's podcast. Hello, everyone. Before we start this week's episode, I wanted to give you a bit of a disclaimer about the visuals for this week's episode. So if you're listening on audio, you can skip ahead about a minute and get to the normal start of the podcast. If you're watching on video, I just wanted to say that my guest today, who is still active in his responsibilities with the United States military, took his time to join me via wireless from a campground near his Army training site. Unfortunately, partway through the video, he lost both connectivity and battery. He then was kind enough to travel to a place where he could use their Wi-Fi and join from there. So in the first half of the video, you'll see that the lighting isn't great. And the second, it just is a bit jarring considering how dark the first half of the video was. Not a big deal. Great interview. I learned a lot. I hope you won't mind either, but I just wanted to give a brief explainer before we got started. With that, we'll start today's podcast. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of the No Bad Questions podcast. This week, I am joined by a guest who is coming to you from the field where he is drilling for his military job. He's also asked me to omit his last name as part of still being employed by the U.S. military. But Lieutenant Colonel Edward is here with me today. And his experience includes 25 years of military career, both in the active Army and in the reserves. He's a field artillery officer with a secondary MOS in engineers and has been a platoon leader, company commander, as well as an intelligence officer at the battalion and brigade levels, and a battalion executive officer. He has 2 deployments. One conducting route clearance, bridging, and construction operations in Iraq in 2007 to 2008, which I'm sure at times got a bit hairy. The second was for a sustainment brigade operating in U.S. Central Command area of responsibility. Presently, he is a chief observer trainer in charge of a team that does exercise, mentorship, coaching, and evaluation at the battalion and brigade levels. Ed, thank you for being with me on No Bad Questions.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
One of the things that Hollywood and novels and TV have all taught me is that literally all people who work for the military are the tip of the spear, action, 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 go, 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 fighting the enemy, combat jobs. But when I was talking to you to get ready for today's podcast, and we were talking about what to talk about, we said, maybe that's not true. Maybe I've been fibbed to by Hollywood. So, is everybody in the military a tip of the spear type of person?
Well, to answer your question that you're really asking, the answer is no. But for any younger folks out there who are in the not so upfront MOSs, I would remind them all that you still ultimately are a warfighter. There's a young lady named Jessica Lynch who found out the hard way that she was a warfighter back in, I believe, 2003, and ended up in Iraqi custody for a period of time. And then, fortunately, she was rescued, but that may not always be the case. So
right.
If you end up going down range, I would remind you to keep your head on straight. Now, as far as Hollywood, and of course, we both have a long history of interest in video games, things like StarCraft or, what do you call it, the Call of Duty, video games, either the first-person shooters or the strategy ones. Generally speaking, you're going to see a lot more of the tip of the spear stuff because it's frankly a lot more exciting most of the time to watch the tip of the spear stuff than it is the support stuff. Now, it's not that the support guys never get any attention. For example,
Right.
In the latest Top Gun movie, there's a nice shout out there to the Navy carrier deck crew at the end with the emergency landing for the F-14. It was good to see the enlisted guys get at least a little moment in the sun there. But depending on who you talk to and how you consider it, like infantry guys would tend to tell you that infantry guys are the only ones that fight and everyone else just supports them. I feel like I understand where they're going with that, but I think they may be a little bit less than generous there because infantry, even within an infantry unit, you'll find soldiers up at the very front who are not actually infantry soldiers. They have medics, communications personnel, field artillery observers that are right up there in the front. And, of course, the tankers are right on the front line, so are the attack helicopter guys. The fighter pilots, they get right up in the front, too, even though they're not holding the ground with their boots. But even not considering the things like field artillery engineers that are in immediate combat support of infantry or A-10s or F-16s, there's a great deal going on behind the scenes. You get very little attention, for example, paid to things like truck drivers. I mean, we've all seen Army movies where people are driving trucks,
Right.
but the average person, I don't know, has a grasp on just how many truck drivers there are, how large an MOS truck driving is, just as an example. Fuelers are another separate MOS that's very, very large. A couple of years ago, we did an exercise called QLEX, Quartermaster Liquid Logistics exercise, and its whole point is just to exercise fuelers. So we had a quartermaster group, which is essentially the equivalent of a brigade, and it had 6 quartermaster battalions under it, all reservists, and the exercise only really simulates the movement of fuel from a port forward to until it ends up in the front lines, and that group coordinating its different battalions that are moving that fuel forward. Now they have simulated combat forces in the game in order to exercise the unit properly, but the actual soldiers doing the work are all quartermasters because that's very important. The M1 tank, for example, is notorious for its incredibly high fuel consumption. Or if you're an Air Force guy, remember a B-52 guy once told me about fighters. He says, well, fast burners burn fuel fast, so they can't stick around that long a lot of the time. And yes, that it's not so much that Hollywood is lying to you as that nobody really wants to watch a movie about pumping fuel.
Okay.
It's very important. It's just not as good entertainment fodder. And that's not a knock on the Logi guys. It's just, nobody really wants to watch a movie about artillery guys either.
I think that's fair enough, and I appreciate you putting it in that way. It's like Hollywood in particular finds it's designed, I would say, to find the interesting, scary, the uplifting, the moving tales of all walks of life, not to focus on, hey, I brushed my teeth today, and I had lunch. There's not generally going to be a movie about the humdrum, and I don't say humdrum like you said. I don't say that to downplay all these other elements of any given career or of our armed forces, but just that's not where the spotlight is going to end up shown, for good or for ill. And yet, what I wonder is, what is the balance then of, and maybe you don't know, but between, is it 80-20? 20% of the military are those infantry and special forces and whatever that are out there on the ground taking the fight to the bad guys? Or is it 2%? Like, what is that balance between those support types of roles that you mentioned and those true sort of combat roles?
Okay, well, that kind of depends on who you ask. There's different ways of counting it.
Okay.
But you can hear ratios anywhere between 1 combat for every 12 support to all the way up to 1 for every 30. I think the truth is closer to the 1 for every 12 because it would... I haven't done careful analysis of this, but the reason I believe that is if you have an infantry... Like I said, you have an infantry unit, you're going to have non-infantry soldiers that are part of the infantry company or battalion and therefore are on the front lines along with the infantry guys, and helping them do their jobs, and they're exposed to all the same risks. And I think that units are more important than numbers of individuals, because we fight as a team. We don't fight as individuals. Also, there are certain types of warfighter that are not, they're not infantry guys, and infantry guys like you say this, but again, your fighter pilots, stuff like that, they go all the way right up to the front line too. And then you also have your more esoteric forces like special forces, but then also strategic missile submarines, for example, are very clearly on the front lines in their own way. So are ICBM crews. They never, fortunately, have had to actually fight, but in their fight, there basically is nobody else. It's them, and that's it. So it depends on the way in which you measure it, but I would venture to say the ratio is closer to the 1 in 12 number than the 1 in 30. Now, one thing I would kind of call your attention to with that is that, well, I guess I actually already said that, the number of personnel in the units that are not actually the fighters, but
blended in.
Yeah.
Okay.
And really, even those warfighter, like a lot of times the officers like me, after you're a lieutenant, you're probably not really a warfighter that much. The company commander, battalion commander are not firing their rifles at the enemy very often. They are managing. Some people don't like that word, but it's essentially what you're doing. You're doing battle management. You are keeping your unit in the fight. It is not Civil War where you're waving your hat on the tip of your saber and jumping out in front 99% of the time.
So that's interesting, because I think that's another one of those, maybe it's a Hollywood myth, or maybe it's just a David myth, but in my head, but I feel like there's this portrayal often of officers being more involved with some of those, particularly in the infantry, and particularly in the special forces. Again, just what gets portrayed in the media, that the officers are out there as well. And if I'm understanding you correctly, that it could still happen, of course, as you mentioned at the outset, with any given individual in the military. It could happen that you need to pick up your rifle and go. But that the officers in these areas, once you're hitting a certain rank, are much less likely to be directly involved. And is that by design? Meaning, is that because the military, the Army, wants to make sure that once you're hitting certain ranks, you're able to sort of step back and be more strategic and be more, at a different level of thought than somebody who's more directly involved in boots on the ground? Is it by design?
Yes, it is a combination of by design, and it's also the nature of modern warfare with modern weapons, and most importantly, modern communication systems, and surveillance, intelligence, things like that. Now, what I would point out is that this, what you're describing pertains very closely to the Army and Marine Corps and land warfare. It's going to be somewhat different, again, in the Navy and the Air Force, because with the air wings, it's largely the officers that do the fighting and the enlisted guys that support, either as crew members on larger airplanes like AWACS or bombers, or as the ground support crew. It's almost like a medieval knight. He goes out to battle on his horse. Well, his horse, his armor, and his weapon are all basically the same thing. They're the airplane. And then if you're talking about the surface Navy or the submarine, the ship fights. It's a whole platform, and everybody is involved in their own way, and the ship is what's really doing the fighting. With land warfare, so, again, to keep it very simple, yes, it is by design, and it is what you said. It's as you move up in ranks, you need to be able to manage wider areas in greater scope, not just in terms of more land area and greater distance, but also in terms of a greater variety of activities. For example, the reason that a general is called a general is that he is a general officer. He is supposed to be able to command pretty much any kind of troops you would find out there if he needs to, or he's put in that position, because a general's only really going to command units that are going to subcombine many specialties. A brigade at a minimum for a 1-star. Most commonly, we think of a major general in charge of a division, a 3-star in charge of a corps, and it is a very comprehensive. We call it combined arms. Okay, because you're not only combining the Army's different arms, the Marine Corps' different arms, you're also integrating that with naval assets, air assets, all that. Now you have a large staff to do it, but even just coordinating that staff is tremendous effort. And while the commander doesn't need to be the expert on every detail, he needs to be able to quickly grasp what his staff is telling him. Now, and this harkens back to what I was saying a minute ago of, like I said, once you're a lieutenant, you really don't get, not a lieutenant anymore, you really don't get to play with the toys that much. Some types of units like infantry and tanks, yeah, as a company commander, battalion commander, you're going to get to ride around on a tank again a little bit. But mostly, even when you're in the tank, your gunner is really going to be fighting the tank. You're going to be fighting the unit. You're up there mainly so you can keep eyes on the battlefield. If you're a helicopter pilot, yeah, you're still going to be out there to a degree, doing some of the fighting. But mostly, you're going to be, you're not going to be on the guns. As an artillery battery commander, I would not be on a howitzer or even a fire direction center. I would be mainly concerned with the battery being where it needs to be when it needs to be there, because you're going to have to fire different fire missions at different times using different propellants, different ranges, different types of munitions, and that all has to be carefully coordinated in advance. And as a commander, you need to keep that on track. Different types of units are going to fight in different ways, but and I'll let you ask another question, but part of the reason that I do what I do now of observing staffs is that now company level has very small staff, but at the battalion level you have your first full staff, and above that the staff and their work, although it is extremely boring, and I would guarantee you would much rather watch a movie about fuel trucks than about staff work. It is very important. That is where all the planning, all the stuff happens before the battle to make it all happen. And a lot of times it seems like death by PowerPoint, but in reality, if you're having a major land battle, you're doing death by PowerPoint at night in the rain after you haven't slept for 36 hours. Ask me how I know. I've been in the Army since before 9/11. We used to do that stuff out at Fort Irwin, and it was fun in its own way, but it was also not fun in its own way. But if you don't plan, you can't fight modern warfare. The systems are just too complex, too many moving parts, too many details. And the job of the staff is to each analyze their particular area of expertise and combine that into a complete picture for the commander of what the situation is and what the courses of action available are, and make recommendations. The commander decides, staff recommends.
And so I'm hearing all this, and then I'm civilian and civilian by background, and I'm trying to translate some of this over into the civilian world, and in particular, lessons to learn for the civilian world, for my career, for how companies operate. And one of the things that is interesting to me about what you just laid out of people coming up through the ranks and needing to end up being able to command a broader array of tools reminds me of folks who come up, whether it's in healthcare or tech. Maybe they're a programmer, maybe they're a nurse, and they become a nurse manager, and now they've gone from really taking care of people to more often, but not exclusively, managing people, and then maybe they become a nursing director or vice president or whatever, and now they're really not probably very often putting their hands on a patient, and they maybe are more involved in the budgeting and so forth and so on. And I think that one of the challenges in civilian organizations is moving people from these individual contributor type roles, or from roles where they really have to know the thing, the job, as you said, the play with the toys, how to code, whatever the case might be, depending on what profession, to moving into management. And I think that, and maybe this is something we can get into later as we get into where you're at now in your career and the training that you're doing. But how does the Army approach the fact that somebody who's great in a technical or a specific job may not be great at the next tier up?
Okay, so it turns out we have a really great solution for that. It's called warrant officers. So most people have heard of a warrant officer before, but a lot of people do not know what it is. Warrant officers are only, I believe, about 2% of the Army. And the first one that people who don't know what it is usually think of as helicopter pilots, because a lot of helicopter pilots are warrant officers, because you need a much higher proportion of officers than normal in an aviation unit in order to fly the aircraft. Okay. And what a warrant officer is. So those who are not familiar, enlisted soldiers and non-commissioned, although officers do have an MOS, which you mentioned at the beginning, non-commissioned officers and junior soldiers are much more specialists in their MOSs than officers are. My two MOSs are 13 Alpha, which is artillery, and 12 Alpha, which is engineer, and they're both general for the entire field. There are, I believe, about 4 or 5 different kinds of artillery MOS around. They keep changing it. It's changed like 5 times since I was lieutenant, so don't quote me. And then there's at one time were like 20 or 30 different kinds of engineer. I think they've narrowed it down to less than 10 now, by combining a lot of the construction MOSs into just 1 or 2. But it used to be the one, heck, for vertical construction that built buildings. There were like 12 different kinds of MOS just for that. But they're going to be much more narrowly proficient in their area. Now, they're going to, this is the whole thing about the junior lieutenant who doesn't know anything. He's going to lean on his NCO and learn from his sergeant. We've seen that in the movies over and over again. That's why, is that the sergeant he has much more experience, and he has much greater technical knowledge in that area, and the lieutenant is still at the play at the toys level of work for the most part. His main job as lieutenant actually is to filter the stuff coming down from above, so the sergeant doesn't have to deal with what's coming from higher. As you move up in rank, you're going to get farther away from that, and that is, well, it's going to be kind of a dictator of success as an officer. Okay, if you cannot learn to manage more and more people, you're not going to have a lot of success as an officer, as a captain or a major. With lieutenants, you can't always tell. Sometimes it's just inexperience and immaturity, but sometimes it's something else. Now, sometimes you have non-commissioned officers who become officers. A lot of times that's very, very beneficial, because they're going to have that, at least some degree of that experience and knowledge, and they're going to have a perspective on what that life is like. But some non-commissioned officers, when they become officers, are not good at adjusting to the officer's role of taking their hands off of the specialty and putting it more on the general side. And I would say, as a general rule, those people would be better served to become warrant officers, because the warrant officer is much more the very experienced technical specialist, but with very little command responsibility. They're mostly concerned with their duties, and I found that experienced and well-motivated warrant officers are an invaluable asset. You almost can't live without them.
That's fascinating, and I'm wondering. We don't have to solve for this today, but I'm wondering how civilian industry can solve for that, and so that's definitely a puzzle I'm going to take away and try to think about. I know some consulting firms have structures like that, and where somebody can be less on a managerial track and more of just a true specialist track, but other industries may not have a great solution for that, and so it's definitely an interesting puzzle.
Yeah, I couldn't speak to individual industries, but I know, you've been in the medical field for some years. My mom was a librarian in the medical research field, and she observed this at the institution she was at, was that scientists who became directors were often not very good directors, even though they may have been brilliant scientists, because it was a complete shift from the laboratory environment to the essentially to the business management environment. They had no training. Or very little training, even though they're not stupid, obviously.
Right.
I guess if I had to make a blanket recommendation, I would say, even if you probably won't have a rank structure like the military does, so maybe a warrant officer duty position per se is not the right answer, but warrant officers are generally paid more than non-commissioned officers, more akin to officers, which is part of the incentive to become one. So if you have somebody that, hey, this guy is really not succeeding in leadership, but he was really, really great at cardiac surgery, maybe keep him at the same pay and move him back over to the operating room. Which, I mean, obviously there's budgetary things there, but it's something to look at.
Yeah. I think physicians are probably not a great example, because a lot of times, being the technical side, they can actually do better than, as I understand it, they can do better than being on the administrative side. But there's no universal truths to anything we're talking about. You know, there's always exceptions in every industry, and the military's probably got plenty of exceptions, and so do we in healthcare, and I'm sure tech and other industries as well. I want to go back now to the idea of a TV show about filling up gas trucks, because I feel like that's a show that if we would have made it, that the Russians' invasion would have gone better, because apparently they had a lot of logistical problems, at least early on. I don't know if they've solved for all those yet, but and by the time, who knows, by the time this actually airs, we're recording it in November, it's going to come out in December, maybe something will have changed, and ultimately I hope that war ends. But I think logistics in the news about Ukraine came to everybody's mind and had already been, to some extent, they might not have thought of the word logistics, they might have thought of the word supply chain because of COVID. Supply chains came into everybody's headspace because of COVID, but let's talk a little bit more about that, because I know you have some expertise in the world of logistics, and it seems to me that one of the things, if the U.S. military doesn't do anything else well, that one thing it does well, exceedingly well, it seems to me, is logistics. We have a lot of forward bases. We have a lot of forward deployed people over the last 20 years. Those people need, as you said, tons of fuel. They need food. They need ammo. They need this. They need that. So talk a little bit, if you would, about those, roles in the military that help support, and here we'll say help support specifically to that supply chain and logistical need of such a huge engine that is the Army.
Okay. All right. So before I go into this, if I comment on the Russians or the Ukrainians and their performance, I just want to say I am not, by anything I say here, pulling for either side. I'm just talking about the realities of what's happening on the ground. If anybody wants to read good daily intelligence reports, I would recommend Institute for the Study of War publishes an open source daily intel update on what's going on. If you happen not to like what they say, I don't know what to tell you. I don't see no reason to think it's not factual. As far as the things like the forward bases, again, I'm talking about how we do things. I know that there are people out there that feel we should not have those things, or people that feel we should have more of those things. I'm not commenting on those things at this time. So when I say, if I say should, I'm talking about should in terms of making it work, not in terms of what our national policy should be. One thing that I think is very important as a continuing to serve officer is that I am not commenting on the wisdom of political leadership, either the current one, the past one, the one before that. If you want to go back to maybe the Civil War, yeah, we can talk about it, but not anything reasonably current.
Fair enough. Thank you.
So, yeah, no, I know you know that, but some people don't tend to forget that. So, anyhow, how that's done is, okay, well, it goes back again to that extensive planning that I was talking about. And at high levels, a lot of that planning is years in advance. It also, but another thing with logistics is one of the reasons we do so well is that we make very, very extensive use of private industry. And private contractors, and also we have under the surface better relations with a lot of places around the world than people think, regardless of what they think about our leadership or they think about theirs. The people that are at the level somewhere between my level and about the Deputy Secretary of Defense, they're the ones that get a lot of stuff done. And they tend to know people better. They've had relations with them in the past. They talk and they make the arrangements. Now, to look at logistics, so you're old enough to remember Desert Storm, right? And, I was just barely not old enough for that fight. I was 15 years old when it started and 16 when it ended. And I remember my mother being glad I wasn't old enough to go down to the recruiting station because I would have. But if you think about that, that is a good picture of the reality of logistics because we got light forces there very, very quickly within just a few days. We had the 82nd Airborne there, some naval assets that obviously are mobile, aircraft. But then it took about, I think, August to about January, February timeframe when the ground war kicked off. So that's about 6 months to move 2 Armored Corps plus a reserve and their associated support elements into theater, along with aircraft and more Navy stuff. And then our allies, some of which relied to some degree on us, although they do help us as well. So that's the dichotomy of our logistics capabilities. We can get the light stuff there very, very quickly, and we can support it. Heavy stuff takes a while. It is not an easy... So the process would look something like this, say, for an armored division. So suppose you wanted to take 1st Cavalry Division and move them from Fort Hood to, well, let's say Romania. Since that's the current thing, let's just say it's Romania. Okay? You need to get that division out of its motor pools and out of its company areas and battalion areas, and you need to get it all loaded onto appropriate transport assets. So for their major platforms, like their tanks and Bradleys and artillery pieces, that's going to be a train. Okay? Some lighter stuff is going to go, different ways, but that's going to be the main thing. You're going to have to take it either to Beaumont or Galveston, I believe, are the 2 ports you would use. And then you're going to have to load it onto 1 or more large cargo ships that are then going to have to sail across the Atlantic Ocean to someplace in France or Belgium, unload, and then you're going to have to put it on the European rail network, and they're going to have to move it forward. And, oh, by the way, this has to happen in and around Union Pacific or BNSF and the European rail networks doing at least some of what they normally do. Because even with a major war, you can't just completely shut down the economy because that economy is supporting your ability to fight. And the same thing with so you need to get that ship from somewhere. It may not be just sitting around at Galveston waiting to load up. It might be in South Africa, and it needs to get back there. You need to get the men there. You're probably not going to send the men on the ship. You're going to fly them in at some point. Because men are a lot easier to fly than tanks are. You can fly tanks 1, maybe 2 at a time on a large cargo plane. Guys, you can fly. I've done it before. It's kind of sucks to fly 18 hours, but you can do it.
Man, yeah.
Yeah, and that's to get... You got to do that for an entire division. So you're talking about 9 to 10 maneuver battalions, 3 or 4 artillery battalions, helicopters, stuff like that. Now, helicopters are a little easier. Once you get them up there, they can forward deploy from Belgium or whatever themselves. But you got to have fuel points set up. You got to have maintenance for helicopters. Armored vehicles require tons of maintenance. They're going to... Whatever maintenance you did before you put them on that train, I guarantee you when you get it off the ship in Belgium, you're going to discover you need to redo a lot of that. Just some stuff will have gone wrong. Murphy will have reared his ugly head. Now, once you're forward, once you're there, now you got the same thing. Tanks do not behave like they do in video games. Okay, you cannot just drive the tank until it takes hits from the enemy and gets worn down after 4 or 5 hits. That tank is probably going to break at some point. It's going to hit a tree branch wrong and throw a tread. It's going to have some diode or some circuit board burn out at exactly the time the manufacturer's warranty says it's going to burn out, and you're going to have to have a replacement part. There's the fuel. There's the ammunition. Those are the first ones I always think of. You've got to feed the soldiers. You've got to have water for the soldiers. All of that stuff. And that is why we have such a large logistical tail. That all stuff is what allows you to fight a modern war. Now, I don't know if you want to go into this. When people talk about the military-industrial complex, I know they like to use that word because President Eisenhower used it, and obviously knew exactly what he was talking about. And it's real easy to think the military-industrial complex is just the F-35 having a lot of problems and Lockheed Martin getting paid a lot of money for it. That is a tiny... That is the same thing as the making all the movies about the infantry guy. It's the same thing. A lot of the military-industrial complex is factory workers there in Ohio, and I know because I've seen the labels on the MREs, making MREs so soldiers can eat them. The military-industrial complex is not different than any other industry. It's providing products. For the most part, it has a good interest in making those products work. Sometimes there are serious problems with those products, but a lot of times they work just fine. And it's also support for those things. It's everything from software upgrades to drinking water to Sidewinder missiles to Christmas cards to send home. That stuff all has to get done, or else you have soldiers getting killed and starving to death. So I would, when people hear that term, I wouldn't. Don't think of the F-35 first. That's great. I understand the issues with that particular aircraft, but they're not unsolvable, and that's really not what it's doing most of the time. And one other thing I do want to put a plug in for is that because of the nature of a lot of the work that the military-industrial complex does, it's Americans that do that work. A lot of times they're veterans. So it should be looked at, I don't want to say necessarily generously or given the benefit of the doubt, but it should be looked at realistically and not as the movie monster that's sometimes portrayed as.
Well, let me. I actually appreciate you bringing that up and taking the conversation that direction, because I think it brings us something interesting worth talking about without putting our tinfoil hats on about the so-called military-industrial complex, which is much of the civilian world has moved to offshore supply chains. You know, China in particular, one of the biggest places we buy consumer goods from, right, as Americans. But Malaysia, and my suits probably from Vietnam, and you know, it's we get things from all over. And from a purely economics perspective, that's great because you can get things cheap, and not necessarily from the American worker perspective. But what you just said is one of the things about the military-industrial complex is we get things here. And I know from some colleagues who work at for government or for government contractors here in Ohio that, you know, that's an important part of a lot of the military's acquisitions is that they're made domestically. They're made here. They're made in the United States because we don't want China to have their hands on the microchips that go into an F-35, to use that as an example. And so we have to keep their hands off of it. So it seems to me that one of the reasons we have this so-called military-industrial complex is because we want and need these things to be made here. And so we haven't necessarily gone to the offshoring like the civilian world does. Do you feel like that's, I know we're speaking in generalities, but do you feel like that's a fair assessment of how this has sort of grown organically because of that need to keep things here?
Yes. I'd say that's fair, although it has a very, very long history. For example, I am pretty sure that there's still a national helium reserve somewhere, just in case we need helium for some military purpose. What, I can't imagine, but my best understanding is that it still exists. I know it did about 30 years ago.
Zeppelins. We got to break out.
Probably how it started was Zeppelins back in the 1920s or 1930s. But I won't say there's no application for helium now, because there's all kinds of cool stuff out there that requires all kinds of different materials and elements, and maybe there is some valid purpose for it. But it goes back to, for example, during the Civil War, wool was considered a strategic material. It was contraband if it got caught going to the wrong place, because that was what you used for uniforms. Kind of sucked to march around in a wool uniform at Gettysburg in July, but probably didn't suck so much in December. So that sort of thing has a long history. Now, I happened to, some years ago when I was trying to qualify for graduate school, because, confession time here, I was not the best student in high school and college the first time around. But I got better as I got older, and I had to take some classes at the local community college, and one I took was an economics class, and the last chapter was on military economics. And I had to take great issue with what the textbook was saying, and I actually got an A on the paper where I did, but because it talked about things like wool, helium, aluminum, fairly generic stuff, and how it would be much more economical to source them overseas and blah, blah, blah. And based on the material that had been taught earlier in the course, that was all quite true. Mm-hmm. What was lacking there, and the point I made in the paper, was that where we get really concerned is availability of those things if an enemy becomes the source of them. So China is obviously a major concern there, but for some years, Russia was our main source of rocket engines, large rocket engines, because we just kind of lost the ability to manufacture them. We weren't buying enough for our own industry, so our contractors just kind of stopped making them.
All right, folks. Well, welcome back to No Bad Questions here with Lieutenant Colonel Ed. Ed, we were talking about, the military-industrial complex and the growth of that over the years, and how, you mentioned that there's a long tail for that. And one of the things we were getting to, I think, just before we kind of had to stop was, even rocketry. We have in recent years perhaps not had, made in the USA, and now we do. So I think that the point of that dialogue, what I had asked was just about the idea of, has some of this growth in this industry been from the requirements to have things be made here? And you were just elaborating on that front. So I don't know if there's anywhere else you want to go with that. If not, I'm sure there's some other supply chain and logistics questions we can get into.
No, all I was really saying was that there is some areas of tension between a lot of what economists would teach you about how a supply chain is best optimized, and necessarily how you want a military one, because you don't want bad actors to have control over your strategic assets, and then also you don't want to be selling your advanced equipment to countries that would very much like to have it and may not be friendly. For example, going back to the F-35, the reason, my understanding is the reason that Turkey kind of got kicked off the program was that they wanted to also purchase the S-400 series surface-to-air missile system from Russia. And the problem with that is, if they have both, there was a feeling that they might test them against each other and then sell the data to both sides. And we would probably rather protect our data more than have the results of their data.
No, that makes sense, and that's fair enough. And so in this, and maybe this is too broad of a question. If so, just tell me. But so in this sort of post-COVID world, or whatever, just with COVID world of snarled supply chains, are there things that you think civilian companies could learn from the way that the military approaches logistics and supply chain?
Probably yes. I think that, well, one thing that this may not be entirely practical for civilian companies, but some level of redundancy is important. Now, I understand in the civilian world that a lot of times redundancy is just not economical, whereas in the military we can get away with non-economical because we have other considerations. But I would say that maybe there's opportunities for redundancy in other ways. For example, mostly maybe in terms of backup plans, alternate methods of doing things that you can keep on the shelf as maybe a secondary source for something if the first one goes bad. That would be a good idea, I think, for a lot of companies. If you're only getting your getting 99% of your, or 98 or whatever percent of your supplies from this one factory, and there's a big COVID outbreak there, or it happens to be located in what's that country in Dilbert, Albonia, and yeah, and then all of a sudden Albonia doesn't want to sell to you anymore. It would probably be a good idea to have a contingency plan in place, even if you don't have necessarily another source or method that you can immediately tap into. Of maybe, have we thought about what we are going to do if that happens? Who will we contact? Who can maybe help us out? What arrangements could we come to? It might be a good idea to have a little planning session and update that once a year.
No, that makes sense. And I think in particular, the idea of resiliency, that's a word I know in my industry that's come to the forefront in the last couple of years for a number of reasons, but supply chain is one of them. I remember a few years ago, this is pre-COVID, there was a hurricane that came through Puerto Rico and did massive damage in Puerto Rico. And what I didn't realize, I'm sure a lot of people didn't realize, is a huge percentage of the IV bags used in the United States came from a factory in Puerto Rico. And so there was a IV bag shortage or a solution shortage. And so, I don't know if it was the bag or the, sort of the saline solution that they put in the bag, but either way, they were all coming through or coming from Puerto Rico. And so there was a shortage for a long time after that hurricane a couple of years ago. And so that idea of resiliency, supply chain experts out there listening, make sure you're thinking about that. You probably already have, I'm sure, in the face of COVID, but that makes a lot of sense.
You actually gave me a thought as you were saying that, because you talk about natural disasters. Another thing that I think would be beneficial for people to think about are not just alternate suppliers and equipment, but also, different routes. If you have a natural disaster or some kind of event, and even if it's not directly affecting your supplies or the destination for your goods, what's a good alternate way to get it there? Even if, like, maybe the trains aren't not running, but the primary branch that you're using to get your stuff from point A to point B, what alternate routes could you work with the railroad company on that? Or this is probably a bad example, so I don't know too much about domestic rail transportation, but the concept is there of that might be something to think about. Is what are the natural effects on the supply chain? What things could come in that could disrupt things, even if everything seems to be hunky dory on the human end of things?
Right. No, that makes sense. And speaking of the human end things there, the last sort of tripod of conversation I wanted to have with you today is some of what you're doing now. And we talked about it earlier about training and development. You talked about the role of chief warrant officers or just warrant officers in the Army and development. And in episode 6, I talked to a guy who's a leadership coach, and one of the things he and I talked about was the concept that I kind of had a moment in talking with him that civilian industries, we're always trying to fight turnover. The military is essentially, except for those warrant officers, essentially 100% turnover organization because of the upper out model. It moves people through its infrastructure so that it's guaranteed that in a certain amount of time, people are gone. There are no, as far as I understand, maybe there's some weird exception, but there are no people who've been in literally the exact same job at the exact same post for 20 years. And in the civilian world, that's mostly gone away, but there used to be the folks who they'd be in the same factory or the same office cubicle or whatever for 20 years. So how has the Army approached the fact that they are essentially what I'm calling a 100% turnover business?
Well, I would point out that I don't know that has always been beneficial to the military. I would say it's been non-beneficial, but it does have drawbacks. High turnover means a steep learning curve. You're almost always in a job that you're learning in the military because you're usually in a job 1 to 3 years, and that first year in any job of any complexity is going to be a huge amount of learning going on, and really even the second year too. Especially with command positions. For example, in the reserves where I am, battalion commands, company commands are usually 2 years. So you're spending almost the first year learning it. You're probably executing the training plan that your predecessor came up with because of the way the planning cycle goes, the yearly training plan. It's already set in place unless you just happen to come into command at the right time where you get to make up your own for the first year. And that's going to be relatively rare. Now, the advantage to it is that a couple things. One is that people who really don't want to be there, it's one of the factors that helps them go away. Right now, at the current time, that may not be such a great thing because we are hurting on recruitment. But in other times, in places, you also don't find yourself getting too much buildup of dead weight. You do sometimes get certain people, particularly in the non-commissioned and warrant ranks, who are able to find a place where they can kind of hang out at the end of their career for 4 or 5 years, but it's not the majority by any means, not even close. It's everybody's met that guy, but that guy is not that common.
Right.
So it is good in that it incentivizes people to find something they want to do, and when they are not there to do the job anymore, they go ahead and find something else to do. If they're on active duty, they move to the National Guard or Reserves, or if they're at retirement time, they go ahead and retire. It's good in that respect, and it also gives people exposure to a wide variety of tasks, even within their own specialty. And then also in most career paths, after the first 5 years, you're going to on and off be in jobs that are outside your area of expertise, and that's considered very important. You want to get those they're called broadening assignments, so that you develop more skills than just, hey, I'm just really good at shooting artillery. You may end up go to work for the Air Force for 2 years, or in some cases, they may send you to go get a master's degree, or whatever the case may be. And that helps broaden the skill set that the force has. Just incidentally, that is also one of the advantages of National Guard and Reserve troops is that because we almost all have civilian jobs and we tend to be older, we tend to bring skills to the fight that active duty soldiers are less likely to have. Not that they don't exist, but you get far more of the I came here straight from high school, or I went to college and came straight from ROTC. Now, although we tend to be older and slower than they are, we also tend to have certain skills that come in handy. Did that get to the question? I'm not sure.
No, I think you answered part of it, and that's okay because I'll just kind of circle back on it and approach it in a different way, because I think part of the part that you did cover, it brings up a different way to ask about it, which is, I mean, you mentioned some of the pros and cons, which I appreciate. And you said, a lot of folks are going to do 1 to 3 years, and the first year, if the job has any complexity, they're going to have a learning curve. And I think that the learning curve is overcome. My impression is the learning curve is overcome in the military very differently than in a lot of civilian jobs. And what I mean by that is you guys seem to have lots and lots of courses and formal training. And except for certain licensed professions, it seems like a lot of the civilian world is OJT, on-the-job training. Is my impression wrong about the number of or the amount of formality that the military puts to training? The amount of formal training that it puts people through. Am I on the right track? And what does that, regardless whether I'm right or not, what does that look like?
No, you're basically exactly correct. That's very important. So any soldier that comes in is going to either go to basic training, and then their it's called AIT, Advanced Individual Training in the Army. I don't know what the Marine Corps calls it. Presumably the Navy and Air Force have their own names for it. Basic training teaches you how to be in the Army. This is how you march. This is how you wear your uniform. This is, how you take a PT test. Now, then you go off to learn to be an infantryman or a signal soldier or a medic or whatever the case may be. If you're an officer, you go through ROTC or West Point or OCS if you're coming from the enlisted ranks. And then you're going to go to an officer basic course, which is also going to teach you your military occupational specialty. So I went to artillery school. And you're going to go to a combination of advanced schools. Now, for officers, you're going to go to an advanced school, which used to be called the Officer Advanced Course. Now it's the Captain's Career Course. And that's going to be, as an officer, the last time that you go to an MOS-specific class for the most part. There may be exceptions out there, particularly for chaplains or doctors or lawyers. Whenever we're talking about officers, chaplains, doctors, and lawyers, they exist in their own world. And I don't want to go into them, but don't apply anything I say to those three types. Warrant officers, I'm not so sure about their education system. I think they spend more time because they're technical specialists. But non-commissioned officers are going to more slowly branch out into more leadership-oriented classes and learning as they go up. But there is a school to go to as a sergeant. There's a school as a staff sergeant. There's another sergeant first class. There's another one for a first sergeant. There's another one as a sergeant major. For officers, there's one at every rank. As a major, I had to go to ILE, which is the first half of Command and General Staff College. As a lieutenant colonel, I'm supposed to go to the Advanced Operations course. At this point, I'm probably just going to retire. I'm getting kind of long in the tooth. But I could. It's not out of the picture either. And you aren't going to get promoted if you don't meet your military education requirements. That's pretty hard and fast. There's very rarely any kind of waivers for that. Some of them are very long. Like one of the big deterrents for me with the Advanced Operations course is it's a year long, and it's like 20 hours a week. That's a whole half-time job for a year. And selling that to the wife, it's an ask.
Right.
But yes, we spend a lot of time on that, and it gets more and more general. Now, leadership is part of it. You get a lot of it also as officers is those higher-level staff efforts that I was talking about. For example, you're usually going to learn some battalion operations, maybe some brigade as a lieutenant, as a captain through OJT. As a major, you're going to learn battalion and brigade and your command and general staff. That's what you go through. And that's really what we teach to or coach on with the units, although we're doing it in the field environment with the unit, and we're not teaching people as individuals. Mm-hmm. And that's on the main thing that we focus on is called the military decision-making process, which is our staff process. And I don't want to go too deep into that because that's a whole nother hour right there, easy. But it's how the Army teaches officers to first conduct mission analysis of what is the mission, and second, what are the courses of actions, and then recommend them to the commander, and then publish them in a way that not just the commander but all the subordinate units understand the mission, have enough time to do their own planning. And as you go up, then the Advanced Operations course, my understanding is it focuses on division, maybe corps level operations, and they do change. Because at the battalion brigade, you're at tactical level, which is essentially the actual fighting. Above that, you have the operational level. A lot of people will stay strategic, but there's actually a level in between there called operational, which they've changed it over the years. It used to be corps level up to theater. Now it's more division level up to theater. And it's strategic. When the military, when we use the word strategic, what we mean is theater level up to national level objectives. When we have to correct lieutenants a lot. Don't say strategic. You're tactical down here. Strategic is what the president worries about, or the Secretary of Defense. I'm sorry, I'm getting a little long-winded here, but those schools are very important to give people at different levels the basis for taking them past some of those problems we talked about in the civilian world of you were a great mechanic, but you're having trouble managing the fleet.
Right.
Or you're a great cook, but you're having trouble managing the restaurant. Right. That is how we try to develop people with varying degrees of success into being able to handle higher level thinking and broader concepts. But I would say we're more successful than not. Because generally speaking, even the guy that when you show up to an exercise like we do, and he seems like, man, he's just not tracking, and he didn't get what he learned in school, and blah, blah, blah. Usually at the end of a week or two, once he's got his hands on it a little bit, we've got him moving in the right direction. Most people are willing to get in there and try, and that's the most important thing.
So what, and I appreciate you kind of laying out and confirming that my impression was kind of on track, and the level of formal classes. I didn't realize there was one, at every rank like that. And so
every rank except first lieutenant. Sorry.
Okay.
I forgot that one.
What lessons then do you think that civilian world could take from that? Because I think one of the reasons the civilian world doesn't do that is budget consciousness. That, as you mentioned, sometimes the military doesn't have in the same way, just because the economics of the military are different. So what lessons could a civilian leader, a CEO who wants to do better at developing their team or something like that, what sorts of lessons do you think they could take from that military style approach?
Well, okay, so let me break it down to three things. One, and before I do that, real quick, one thing I would say about the military system is that the particular way we have it set up right now, I would say if I could make one improvement to it, would be to front load stuff a little bit more. There's stuff I took in the class as a major that I really felt like I should have been taught as a second lieutenant. It was not too advanced to understand, and it took too much time later on. So I would say that the military could also do a better job of front loading some things. But to go on to there, so first of all, I would say you can look at existing resources and what we're doing. And I mean, obviously, very few companies would have the ability to develop something as robust as we do, or maybe as formalized. But there's plenty of existing resources, including additional civilian education, even if it's community college classes. Master's degrees are expensive, but if you can come up with a week-long course at the community college, some collaboration, there may be opportunities there. And then there's 8 gazillion books out there by military people where you can probably glean something out of there. I think the one that I would say is probably most prominent right now is Jocko Willink's material. I don't know if you've read it. Yep. I think I've read all but like the last 2 chapters, and I put it down and haven't got back to it. But it's good stuff, and he puts it in a way that the average person can understand, which is the real strength of that book, is he doesn't get distracted with military jargon.
Right.
There are ways I would probably develop his material a little more, but I won't go into it right now. So that would be first. Second of all, I would say you need to be realistic about, because you're going to have a much wider variety of people in civilian life. To a certain degree, different jobs attract different personalities, and people who just don't want to be in the military, for the most part, aren't going to be in the military,
right,
or at least not for very long. We aren't drafting anybody, and I don't see any reason to think we're going to. So, there's going to be a certain military personality with our way of doing things. So you got to tone it down a little bit. You're not going to be able to maybe be as aggressive about that kind of training as the military is.
True.
But I would say identifying the right personalities, and then also, and this is I'm trying to think of a way to say this. Training, I have found, is best when people are doing as much training of themselves as they are being trained. The military expression we like a lot is death by PowerPoint, because a lot of trainings are PowerPoint. But even with those, it's a lot of them you will find you stop after a certain portion of time and you do some kind of practical exercise. Now, sometimes that practical exercise is a little bit cheesy in certain classes, but even when it is, it just gets people moving around, gets them talking a little bit. The people who are dozing off in the back of the classroom are getting engaged. But also you're assessing, who's involved, who are the people who are the movers and shakers, who are the kind of worker bees, and who are the people that are not as involved. But also it's getting them engaged. It's making them think more than they would if you just stood up there and talked at them. Now, works better with some subjects than others, but I think that one thing people could really benefit from is to understand, try to get people to teach themselves as much as they are being taught. That may not be practical with everything, like some specialties may be highly technical, and you really do need to walk people through it, hold their hand,
right,
especially if safety is a big concern. But overall, that's what I would recommend, and I think that's also a good way to identify as you're doing that. Hey, is this guy going to be good in that leadership role, or is he going to be better to be the wrench turner, or be the cook, or be the cardiac surgeon?
Right. No, I think that those are good pieces of advice, and for organizations and leaders that may want to continue to improve their retention, or if you can't, and this is my thought, is I think the turnover is somewhat of just a reality. I don't know that this is much of a passing phase. And if it's not, then we all have to do better in all civilian industries to just deal with that. By deal with that, I mean, is that adjusting staffing so that when we have just constant turnover, we're overcoming inefficiencies from more green workers, investing more in training like we were just talking about. So, no, I definitely think that that's good advice for leaders. And so the last thing I'd like to end on is if you've got any advice for young people out there thinking of a military career, either as a primary job, active duty, or reserves. Maybe they're in their 20s and they've got a job, but they're looking at further options. Any advice to folks like that looking to get started on a military career?
Okay, yes. Well, I have a lot of advice, but I'll try to keep it succinct. Tell you a little story. At my church, we had a young man several years ago now, 5 or 6 years ago, I think. And he had a family situation where his parents were far more elderly than would be the norm for his age. And he was thinking about joining the military. He came to me and he said, "Hey, what do you think about me joining?" And I said, "Look, I think it would be a good idea. Your father is 80. I think he was 80, somewhere in that neighborhood. He was quite old. This complicated situation. Your mother has had health issues. You cannot rely on trying to figure out what you want to do for a living when you grow up for a long period of time. You need to have something." But I told him, look, unless you want the military to be a career, try to find something that will give you a skill that is useful in the civilian world. Communications, IT, great. Medical, great stuff. Even truck driving, great. Construction, great. One thing that I faced when I got out of active duty the first time, not a whole lot of call in civilian life for artillery officers, it turns out. So, general military experience was good. The blowing things up 30 kilometers away, not too many employers interested in that. So it was the advice I gave him, was figure out to what degree you're interested in that military career. Now, if you're not sure and you want to try doing the carrying rifles and jumping out of airplanes bit to start, don't be scared to, because if you do decide to reenlist, you can change MOSs. And if you don't, that will still give you valuable, very general experience that will still put you ahead of your peers. And I would put on 1A, if that was point 1, this is point 1A. Keep in mind that the GI Bill is a very, very valuable asset to have. That will really, really open you a lot of flexibility in terms of your future educational endeavors. And that does not only mean college. You can use that. For example, if you join the United States Border Patrol, you can get paid your GI Bill while you're at that academy, even though you're getting paid and housed by Border Patrol or any other federal law enforcement agency, and probably state ones as well. So it's just free money. But it will help you through. I got my master's degree on the post 9/11 GI Bill, and there are actually 2 different GI Bills.
Okay.
So do not reject that. Also, if you happen to live in Texas, and I don't know if other states have a program like this, there's a thing called the Hazelwood Act, which very succinctly is Texas's own state-level version of the GI Bill. So if you sign up and it says Texas on your place's entry into active duty, you can qualify for the Hazelwood Act. And that's, you go to a Texas state school, of which there are several. It's very easy to go that way, and there are maybe options in some of these programs to help your kids go to school, too. That's 1A, is keep in mind what it's going to do for you down the road.
Okay.
Second of all, don't get too bogged down in either the glory stories or the misery stories. I remember when I was a kid and Top Gun came out, Navy recruitment was through the roof all of a sudden. Everybody wanted to go fly the F-14. It's a great recruitment tool for the Navy, but not that many people are going to get to fly F-14s. And it's kind of a letdown then if you end up scraping paint on the side of a cruiser instead of flying the jet. Somebody's got to do it. It sucks. I'm really glad I didn't enlist in the Navy for that reason. Anyhow, but you may have had people in your family that, they talk about Vietnam or they talk about Iraq or Afghanistan and how rough it was, how awful. Yeah, war sucks. It's not fun. It's not a good time. There are parts of it that are positive experiences, the friends you make and the relationships you build and the things you learn. But there are parts of it that are very negative. I mean, I know I've been reasonably lucky in that regard, but I have some friends that are carrying a lot of baggage and will be for the rest of their lives. Mm-hmm. But either way, do not be enchanted by it, and do not be afraid of it either, because somebody's got to do it. But also, if you're the one that steps up and says, "I will do it," it will pay off for you as well. And along with that, also, recruiters. Well, some recruiters do lie to you because there's bad apples. Recruiters will rarely lie to you, but they are not always telling you the truth that you think they're telling you. Find somebody experienced, whether it's a junior ROTC instructor at your school, a relative, older man or woman at church who's a prior service. Even if they're not the right service, run anything a recruiter says by them, and make sure you're actually understanding what the recruiter is telling you. And so that would be 2A. And then third. It would go back to the skills again, but don't be afraid to consider the National Guard, the reserves for the other forces, especially going after. Active duty guys might quibble with this. I frankly think our reserves and our National Guard are pretty good. Like I said, now there's issues that come from just not training every day. We train once a month. Plus several events throughout the year. You move up in rank, you end up doing a lot more than 1 weekend a month and 2 weeks a year. Gets more than that, but it's still not what active duty does. But like I said, the other side of that is we bring things to the table that they don't have, and also we have a lot of us have active duty experience. So don't discount those things. You can still get the MOS skills. You can still learn a lot of the same things. In this day and age, you will probably get some sort of deployment somewhere, even if it's only for a 3-week annual training in Egypt or something like that. You might get to go somewhere cool. Like I got to go to Panama 1 year for annual training. It was pretty fun. We built a school and a clinic. It was a cool assignment.
Oh, that's cool.
There's fun stuff to do. There's good experiences. So don't be afraid to explore those options as well, because the educational benefits are there with those also. And along that same line, I would recommend to any young person, do not decide in advance which service you want to be in. Talk to recruiters from all 5. Don't forget the Coast Guard. Talk to the Coast Guard. My granddad was in the Coast Guard. Coast Guard's got some great opportunities too, and they're not like the weak service. They don't have the combat power of the other ones, but there are Coast Guardsmen out there taking risks with their lives every day. So if you want to do exciting stuff, there's exciting stuff to do there too. Check out all your options. Don't make up your mind in advance. This is the one thing I'm going to do and only that, and then be disappointed if you can't get it. There's maybe something out there you didn't know about that you'd say, hey, you know what? I'd rather do that.
No, that makes sense. I appreciate all of those points for people who are listening. I appreciate your time today. I appreciate you when we had the battery situation on your device. You making a drive out of your campsite and getting to a place that we could finish this interview. And I appreciate your service. So just gratitude all around today. And thank you for coming and talking to me here on No Bad Questions.
Well, thanks a lot for having me. It was great to get to talk to you. It was really great to get to talk to things that I think the general public does not get to hear about very often, that we in the military could probably do a better job of communicating to people. And I really appreciate your question for young folks trying to come in or thinking about coming in, because that's the future. My time with the military is very close to the end, and there's new generations coming in. So anything I can pass along to younger folks that's going to help them out in the future, I think is important.
All right. And with that, we'll wrap it up. Thank you very much.
Thank you.